Hey guys, thanks for joining me for another Bible study. Today we're going to look at Matthew 12, verses 1 through 8, Mark 2, verses 23 through 28, and Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. And of course, this is a continuation of the Harmony of the Gospel series where we study the Gospels chronologically, or best we can anyway. But today's lesson comes from, when Jesus and his disciples were criticized for picking grain on the Sabbath. And this is what it says in Matthew chapter 12, starting verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple desecrate the day and yet are innocent? I tell you that one greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Now, look at Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 28, and see what he says. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath.'" Now, Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain field, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, 'The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.'" Now, here we have a discussion of the Sabbath, or essentially that part of the law of Moses. And the law of Moses allowed people walking down the footpaths through the fields to help themselves to whatever was growing there. But not too much should be gathered. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 24 and 25, it says, "If you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat all the grapes you want, but do not put any in your basket. If you enter the neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to his standing grain." So the disciples here picked grain from the stalks of wheat, apparently rubbed it between their hands to remove the husk, and they ate. Well, the Pharisees here condemned them. They didn't condemn them for eating the grain, but condemned them for the act that the Pharisees considered work on the Sabbath. They had listed a number of activities that they considered work, which they thought should be prohibited on the Sabbath to keep it holy, so that they wouldn't do any work. This included many nitpicky things. I mean, tying, untying a knot, writing two letters of the alphabet, etc. But the Pharisees had in fact established 39 different categories of actions that they forbade on the Sabbath. And I looked it up, and the first 12 of these rules were steps leading to production and preparation of bread. And that's sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, excuse me, threshing, winnowing, selecting, grinding, sifting, kneading, and baking. And this one of those is which the Pharisees were saying the disciples were guilty of breaking. But let's see, that was first 11. The next 12 apply to similar steps in preparation of clothing, from shearing a sheep to actual sewing of the garments. These were followed by 7 steps in preparing the carcass of a deer for use as food or for leather. The remaining items listed have to do with writing, building, kindling, extinguishing fires, and also they deal with transportation of articles from one place to another. And all this on the Sabbath. And in addition to these major regulations, there were countless other provisions concerning the observance of the Sabbath. Most commonly known is the so-called Sabbath day journey, about 2,000 cubits, somewhat less than 2/3 of a mile. And I've read that that distance actually changed over time, one way or another. And it was also counted as Sabbath breaking to even look in a mirror fixed to a wall. What that had to do with anything, I have no idea. But and get this, lighting a candle was against the law on the Sabbath, or against their rules, on the Sabbath. And sadly, the same regulations permitted an egg laid on the Sabbath to be sold to a Gentile, and allowed for a Gentile to be hired to light a candle or a fire that day. And we can begin to see why the people were so burdened by the law, more from the laws of men than the law of Moses, of course. But we can also see how these rules were sort of hypocritical at times. And but back to our passages for today. In the eyes of the Pharisees, the disciples were reaping or winnowing grain, which was strictly forbidden on the Sabbath. They were breaking the law, at least their part of the law, their rules. But God's law clearly said that crops should not be harvested on the Sabbath. I mean, that's agreed upon. That's what the law of Moses said. This would prevent the farmers from being greedy, ignoring God on the Sabbath, along with everyone else for that matter. It also protected the laborers from being overworked. It had some deep impacts into everyday life for sure, but the law clearly did not mean that someone could not fulfill their hunger by gathering a few grains of wheat on the Sabbath. Jesus argued that ritual laws must give way to human needs at times. He even gave them an example. In an emergency, David and his men, King David and his men, had even eaten the consecrated showbread from the temple. And of course, they held King David on a high standard too. But in 1 Samuel chapter 21 is where we find this instance. Starting in verse 1, it says, David went to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" David answered Ahimelech, the priest, "The king charged me with a certain matter and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about your mission and your instructions. As for my men, I have told them to meet me in a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever you can find.' But the priest answered David, 'I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women.' David replied, 'Indeed, women have been kept from us as usual whenever I set out. The men's things are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?' So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away." So this particular bread was limited to the priests alone, as it was replaced by fresh bread each week. God however, did not punish or condemn David or his men for this action, because this need for food was more important than regulation. Essentially, Jesus was saying, if you condemn me, then you have to condemn David too. They weren't prepared to condemn David, but were looking for any and every reason to condemn Jesus. And Jesus was a lawbreaker in their minds. Everything he did was wrong. In Matthew, we're told that Jesus gave these religious leaders an even harder pill to swallow. The priests consecrated the letter of the law, so to speak, every Sabbath. They were found working on the Sabbath. There was no denying that. The priests were allowed to work on the Sabbath as they performed sacrifices and their job, and they conducted the worship services. This Sabbath work was done as a service to God and to aid others in their relationship with Him. So this wasn't sin. Jesus continually emphasized the intent of the law rather than the letter of the law. The intent of the law rather than the letter of the law. The Pharisees had lost sight of the spirit of the law. For sure, they demanded that their rigid interpretation of the law be followed, no exceptions. Their rules was as good as God's rules, in other words. Jesus claimed that he was greater than the temple and the Lord of the Sabbath. He was the Lord of the Sabbath. These claims from Jesus were sufficient evidence in the eyes of the Pharisees to once again condemn him for blasphemy. And let's face it, the Pharisees had already turned against Jesus. They were jealous of his popularity, the miracles that he had performed, and the authority in his teachings. They were just jealous of him. They refused then to accept all the evidence that he was from God and he was exactly who he proclaimed to be. Son of God, the Messiah, the Son of God, the Son of Man. They were not willing to acknowledge him because they were not willing to give up their position, their power, their authority that they thought they had. He exposed them. Jesus exposed them for their pettiness, their stubbornness, their hypocrisy. They had no compassion. They had lost the intent of the law, period, the spirit of the law. And it's clear that Jesus' disciples weren't even wanting to sin here. They weren't wanting to harvest grain for a profit on the Sabbath or anything like that, but simply to satisfy their hunger, just as David did with his men. They weren't working on the Sabbath. The Pharisees could not see beyond their own nitpicky rules here. They didn't have room for compassion in their belief system at all. And here's really the overarching lesson for today. We must make sure that we do not get so caught up in our rules and rituals that we miss a relationship with God. The Pharisees were so concerned about their religious traditions, their rules, their rituals, that they had forgotten the reason for the law in the temple, to bring people into a relationship with God. And they had forgotten grace and mercy and compassion along the way as well. But you see, we can be doing all the right things for the wrong reasons. We can miss a sincere relationship with God, even though we go through all the motions of service and worship and do our best to keep His commands. It begins with a heart that is right with God and that loves God. All of our actions and words should be a result of sincere relationship with the Lord and a deep desire to please the one that has saved us. Jesus appeared on the scene of human history to show us what God truly values. He loves mankind and continually shows compassion upon us. He admittedly has His standards that we're to strive to live up to, but also He has grace and mercy ready for the times that we fall short. His compassion for us is great, and I'm certainly thankful for that. I don't know about you, but let's don't miss a relationship with God trying to keep up with human tradition and human rules. Let's look at what the Word has to say about it and follow through with what the Word has to say about it, and not try to add our little nitpicky rules and regulations and, well, opinions. I pray this lesson has been a blessing to you. May God bless you and keep you and give you peace till we can meet here again. Study God's Word.